Today's event is being hosted by Inceptua. Inceptua is a global pharmaceutical and services company providing pharma and biotech companies with world-class expertise in comparator sourcing, distribution, and implementation, as well as a specialized partner for rare disease and specialty products. China is now the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world, and with a more harmonized and efficient clinical trial approval process, it is seeing a large increase in clinical trial activity, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ensuring that a clinical trial supply strategy is in line with current market requirements and that a sponsor has considered all of their sourcing options is essential to reducing time, resources, and costs. Today's webinar will provide unique insights into this strategy and the key areas to focus on for success. Our speakers will discuss strategic options for comparator sourcing in China and critical factors to consider in designing a clinical trial program. Attendees will learn about the considerations and hurdles for running trials in China and how to overcome them, as well as 3 areas to consider when choosing a sourcing partner in China. Our second presenter and panelist will be Philip Gregory, Vice President, Asia Pacific for Clinical Trial Services at Inceptua.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about strategic comparator sourcing in China. My name is Chen Liu. I'm based in Beijing, China. I'm the clinical research sourcing strategist from Pfizer. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about the strategic sourcing in China from the point of view of clinical trial sponsors' perspective. This is today's agenda. First of all, we will look at the highlights of drug registration regulation. As most of you know that the regulations in China have been evolving very much in this year. The Pharmaceutical Administration Law has been effective on December 1st, 2019. After that, the drug registration regulation has been updated as well and effective 6 months later. With that updates, the authority released over 50 supportive provisions and guidelines for DRR in 2020 and about 30 drafts. And then we will talk about the regulation environment on comparator sourcing and how to define an optimal sourcing strategy for China. Now let's look at the highlights of drug registration regulation. Like I said just now, this regulation has been effective on July 1st, 2020. This is the link of the NMPA website for this regulation. In this version of DRR, we can see the government's intention to establish globally harmonized, science-based, transparent, and predictable regulatory framework to encourage the innovation and promote the development of the generics. The review and approval optimization shows the CTA will be effective 60 working days after the application. Actually, this has already been studied from 2018. Other than this version also allows the overseas clinical data from the trial follows ICH and NMPA. The guideline was released in 2017, so this 2020 version of the regulation doesn't include any requirements. By this update, the authority also promotes accelerate approval policy continuously to close the gap of the innovation drugs. Those are the accelerate pathways, breakthrough therapy, conditional approval, and the priority review. With so many actions, we do see the promoting CTA and NDA registration mechanism. However, speaking of the new drug approval timeline, the HGRAG approval is also a critical element to the simultaneous development and registration accelerate of innovative drugs in China. Okay, let's move to the next topic, regulatory environment on sourcing. Frankly, there are very few wordings in the regulations on comparator sourcing in China. The definition of comparator in good clinical practice is an investigational or marketed product or placebo used as a reference in a clinical trial. We have two guidelines below that have specific requirements on the comparator selection. The first one is consistency evaluation of generic drug, which clearly indicates that the reference drug should be selected according to the drug list published on Center of Drug Evaluation website. This drug list is a live document. CDE periodically publishes the reference drug for this type of clinical trial. Some of the listed reference drugs are not even marketed in China. For this type of clinical trial, there is no clinical trial approval letter. So if the reference drug has to be sourced outside of China, the sponsor will need to apply the one-off import license for importation. In this case, the one-off import license is equivalent to the clinical trial approval letter to support the regular import license application and the shipment clearance from the customers. Pfizer has a case to source glucophage specifically manufactured by Merck Serono France for a China BE study. This product is not commercialized in China. We reached out to Merck Serono through Transcelerate to figure out to which countries the product from this particular manufacturer site supplies, and Inceptra has successfully secured this product in Colombia with all the required documents supporting importation. Another guideline is for biosimilar study. This guideline defines the reference drug must be with approval of importation or clinical trial. If different reference drug has been used, the comparative studies must be conducted to demonstrate comparability for it, and for reference drug used at different phases of similarity study must be from the same manufacturer site. This guideline gives us very limited options on the reference drug selection. The best is always to use the commercial products sourced in China locally, but we normally get strong objections from the innovators and have to look at the alternatives outside of China. In this slide, I listed the documents needed for different sourcing scenarios: sourcing in China, sourcing outside China, and importing from Beijing and Shanghai ports, and importing with one-off import license. Like I mentioned, sourcing in China is always the easiest way. We will need the clinical trial approval letter, CFA import license for the imported drugs, and the GMP certificate. Those documents are to be filed at clinical site, as well as EC submission and ready for the inspection when the trial is closed. Sourcing outside China but importing from Shanghai and Beijing is different. We can see importing from Shanghai needs more documents like the certificate of origin, package insert, picture of 6 sides of the commercial pack, and a statement about drug allocation to clinical sites. Looks like Shanghai is more tough than Beijing, but those additional documents are actually quite easy to obtain. And you may know that there is a requirement on remained shelf life that at least 12 months remained shelf life when shipment enters in China. Shanghai is more flexible with it, but Beijing is very strict. For one-off import license, other than those documents, we also need the purchase contract as well. A few general highlights on the importation. The first leg transfer document is always a big challenge for China to source comparator overseas. Sometimes CFA cannot be provided when sourcing in US, and one-off import license applies to the studies without clinical trial approval letter, for instance, the consistency evaluation study or the biosimilar study. And the last bullet is the one we talk about on the shelf life. Those are all about source the products manufactured by the other company. But when we talk about comparator sourcing, one thing we cannot ignore is to source the commercial product manufactured by our own companies. In China, Pfizer works with our internal commercial team to obtain them. But because of the good supply practice in China, we have to use GSP licensed depot as receiver, which leaves us very limited options. How do you source your own Chinese presentation commercial product? Please share your practice via chat function. With so many sourcing situations domestically and internationally, and the challenges bringing the products into China if we sell outside of China, how can we come to an optimal sourcing strategy for China? Let's move to the last topic today, sourcing strategy defining. In Pfizer sourcing concept, we categorize the sourcing model into central sourcing, local sourcing, and site sourcing. In central sourcing model, we normally source the commercial products in US and EU. The supplies will be delivered to central depots, feeding all the countries and sites. A full clinical label typically is required, and the drugs are managed within Pfizer inventory system. Local sourcing means the commercial drug product is purchased locally in the country. The product sources vary across countries participate the clinical trial. The following labeling, storage, distribution will be managed largely in-country vendor-owned depot or third-party depots, which are outside of Pfizer inventory system. The locally sourced materials must be used according to the approved marketing authorization and package insert. Otherwise, a full clinical label will be used in central sourcing model. Based on the local regulation, an auxiliary label may be required. Site sourcing, as well as we all know, is the sites to manage product sourcing with a prescription. It is the CRO and study team to manage the contract with sites. Depending on the regulatory requirement or clinical practice, a pharmacy label may be required. When a protocol comes in and China is one of the countries, where do we start with the sourcing strategy? I personally start with a couple of questions. Internally, I will read through the protocol, especially the study design and the drug administration sections. I need to know the number of the patient, dosing regimen. With this information, I can have a rough estimate on the drug quantity. I also need to have a awareness about patient and disease to better understand the administration methods. If there are a couple of forms of the drug available, I need to know the commercial drugs needed in the study. If generics good enough to use or only brand drugs we should consider. Study timeline is another critical information to define the supply plan, initial delivery, resupply. The regulatory specific requirements should be considered as well if it is biosimilar study or consistency evaluation study as what talked about just now. Externally, with the sourcing request being raised to our vendors, I need to know the product details. For instance, the availability, pricing, strength, pack size, lead time, and the minimum order quantity. With these feedbacks, I will review the sourcing need to refine supply plan. We need to know what kind of documents the vendor is able to provide, especially when sourced outside of China. The documentation is key for importation. The supply chain here actually shows the vendor's capability on distribution network. Not every vendor owns depot or third-party depot in country, so it is very important for us to understand how the supplies would be moved for receiving, labeling, and distribution. The movement may increase the impact on regulatory submission. And of course, we need to know an overall cost to make vendor selection. The overall cost includes the drug cost, distribution, labeling, and the other depot activities. For China, the VAT is 13% for drug purchase, which can be deducted. So please be careful when you look at the proposals from different vendors. These are very basic information for us to make sourcing strategy. Other than this, I think we also need to look at options from another angle. This slide shows the areas we also need to investigate to make the decision. Operational-wise, we need to consider access to supplier vendor pool. We need to know the product quantity and the consistency, which makes make sure we can keep using the identical product through the entire study. Meanwhile, we also need to know if the study allows flexibility on comparator. Sourcing situation changes quickly. Most recently, we've got big impact to source certain products under this COVID-19 situation. It is always good to have some flexibility. When a sourcing strategy confirmed, it doesn't mean this strategy will remain until study close out. As I said, sourcing situation changes quickly. It happens sometimes that some challenges came up for resupply. We always should be ready for just to be ready to revisit the sourcing strategy at any time during the study conduction. The label cost, timeline, and inventory transparency looks not that important comparing the drug availability, drug cost, but they are the key elements to decide if the sourced drug can be managed smoothly. A good inventory system, reasonable label cost, and timeline will ensure seamless resupply and better inventory management. From regulatory perspective, already talked about a lot, we still should be careful about the filing requirements, especially the comparative details need to be captured into regulatory filing. And what we have done should minimize the filing complexity instead of increase. For global trial, if the sourcing for China is different from the other countries, we also need to consider to include the comparative information for China. The label requirement in China is pretty simple. As long as it is Chinese presentation, the auxiliary label is sufficient, no matter it is IMP or non-IMP. Patient compliance here, I think, is mainly about the pack size. Which pack size is better to maintain the patient compliance? Finance-wise, it's just about all the cost, same as what we talk about. The overall cost includes both of drug cost and all the other activities cost. If importation needed, the VAT for importation also should be considered. I started my current job in 2014. The works assigned is based on study rather than the region, so I have the opportunities to manage sourcing strategy for many of the other countries. I would say that China is one of the challenging countries with complicated sourcing situations and quite unique regulatory requirements. What I talk about is just the fundamental principle and elements when we look at sourcing options for China. But I think the key is always the product availability, which needs to leverage the vendor's resource to manage. So next, Philip Gregory will continue this topic and give us more details from his point of view. Let's welcome Phil. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. To really give the sort of view of, from a vendor's perspective, what you're looking for in sourcing your study in China. Just a little bit about Inceptua in China. We have offices and staff in both Shanghai and Beijing. We conduct local strategic sourcing, the whole project management, storage, packaging, labeling and distribution for our sponsors. We have Chinese employees, but we also have Chinese-speaking Western personnel, both within China and also in our international offices in Europe. We work with a GSP partner who has a wholesale license, and we have direct access to China-registered products for comparators within China. We've been operating in China for many years, and we do understand the complicated CTS process, and we are well positioned to deliver high quality products and services to ensure that your study is a success in China. And Inceptua has been globally sourcing comparators for around about 20 years. As Chan mentioned, the China is currently going through some fairly major changes in terms of healthcare. There's a tremendous government emphasis on the future of healthcare in China, particularly with an aging population, increasing rates of cancer in China, and also potentially quite large increases in non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. So the government has invested heavily over the last 15 years in the healthcare system. As you've heard, they've streamlined the regulatory process, which is all aimed at allowing new drugs to be approved much faster than there was the case in the past. There will be significant growth in biologicals over the next 5 years. And as you know, there's been significant multinational companies' investment in their own research centers in China as well. The drug reform process has gone through some significant changes, and we can't rule out there being further changes in the future, but certainly with China joining ICH-GCP, we can certainly predict that there'll be a much greater involvement of China in global phase 3 trials and global phase 3 clinical development programs. To give you a quick checklist on what to look for in looking for comparator sourcing for China, I can't emphasize enough that it's really important to have a very clear strategy for your study from the outset. Know exactly what type of study you need to do, and that will then define the regulatory pathway that you need to embark upon to make sure you get rapid approval for your study. In terms of the sources and the drugs that you're going to use, you need to define early on whether you're going to be sourcing internationally or whether you're going to be sourcing domestically. It is, as you've heard, much easier to source domestically, whether you're thinking about branded products or generic products. That's also really important to do. Clearly, country of origin is important as well, as is the documentation that's available for the importation of products. Clearly, the sooner you can plan for your study and providing adequate lead time will allow you to have an adequate shelf life, which must for China be a minimum of 12 months. You need assurance of supply over the duration of your study, and therefore it's very important that you can assess the ongoing certainty of supply over a study that may last 2, 3, or possibly 4 years. So that's really important because you will need to make sure that you can source and supply the same product for the duration of the study. So continuance of supply is really important, as is the overall supply chain, making sure that any special requirements in terms of temperature requirements or shipping or special import requirements can be made in terms of the documentation that's needed. And as you've heard, there are different import requirements for Beijing and Shanghai. On the face of it, Shanghai seems to be require more documentation, but certainly our experience is that Shanghai is certainly easier to import products into than Beijing. And of course, cost considerations for your study and the cost of those comparators is also a major factor in your decision making, but should not really be the major factor. Clearly, end-to-end clinical supply is really, really important. What you need to look for is someone who understands the whole process of getting the drug into China or sourcing the drug in China, getting it to your in-house clinical research team or to the CRO, and then to the clinical sites, and the whole logistics and supply chain that needs to go alongside of that to make sure all of the correct documentation, inspections, all the duty and the VAT payments are made, that you've got a good depot and warehousing and good inventory management. If you need to do relabeling and repackaging, to make sure that that is built into your planning and your timelines. in addition to making sure that you've got very good distribution. China is a very, very large country, and it's really important to have very strong supply chain and distribution requirements for your study. Also, it's really important to make sure your collections and returns, particularly for destruction and disposal, are also built into your planning and reporting for your study. So many situations and many factors that you need to consider in the overall running of your study once you've decided on your strategy and your comparators. If I could hone it down into 3 real key factors for success in running your study in China, it's really important to understand the market from all of the factors we talked about, from the regulatory perspective, the quality of the products you're going to be sourcing, the Chinese culture and the way of doing business, to make sure you're working with a company that is very transparent in terms of the financing and the invoicing, and also that you're assured of a very strong and robust supply chain. So you need to understand the market that you're getting into, and then you need to optimize your sourcing strategy. As I said, define it very clearly from the outset. Make sure that you're buying into full service logistics, and really try and limit the length of the supply chain, because the longer the supply chain, the more complicated the sourcing strategy can be. And of course, choose the right partner, work with them as early as possible, and make sure that that partner has very good access and reliable access to the products, whether you're sourcing them outside of China or indeed within China. So 3 steps: define your strategy and your needs, make sure your team, your clinical team, your drug supply management and procurement all work together. It's really good to have the protocol outline. You're probably going to have to provide disclosure, and make sure that the financial criteria are defined very early on. We like to identify more than one potential solution, because the cheapest solution may not always be the best one, because we need to make sure that you've got adequate backup options, to make sure that you've got both reliable and a very cost-effective supply throughout your trial. Then we work with our sponsors to secure your preferred option, to make sure you get regular updates on where the product is, on the project status, and also in terms of assistance in monitoring product stocks, working with our sponsors to make sure that we have adequate lead times for reordering and for supply through the duration of the study. So 3 steps for success, but as you've heard, China is not a simple market to work in, so make sure you work with someone who really understands the market and understands your needs. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand back now to Ryan, and we'll hopefully take your questions. Thank you very much.